that people start looking for simple solutions, and the simplest solutions to them looks like everything will end when Putin and Ukraine will sit at the table of the negotiations.
What do you tell them? What do you say to them?
We say to them that we have lived under a ceasefire for 8 years, starting from 2014, and look where it got us.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. What was unthinkable 8 months ago is now increasingly talked about by Russians who have fled their country because of the Kremlin's devastating attack on Ukraine. The whispers. Could President Putin be replaced, and by whom? His failures are stark in this ill-conceived war on Ukraine. The price may have become too heavy to bear for a Russia hammered by sanctions, while on the battlefield Russian forces are in retreat and humiliated by the Ukrainian advance. As we speak, jubilant scenes in the city of Kherson, now back in Ukraine's hands. One of the cities and regions Putin announced was annexed and would remain part of Russia forever. This week's podcast interviews were recorded just as Russian forces announced they were withdrawing, but even before Ukrainian soldiers were inside the city. All right, Dmytro Natalukha is a Ukrainian MP. He's also chair of the Economic Affairs Committee for Ukraine. Dmytro, it's really great to meet you. And, I hope that this is the start of a longer-term relationship with our podcast. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Dana. It's an honor to be with you.
You've just come back from Europe.
I am actually in Europe waiting for my plane in the evening. So
where are you now?
I'm in Paris.
Paris. And forgive me, Ukraine is part of Europe, but you've just come back from a meeting with European leaders. Tell me, what is the mood in Europe? Because we hear increasing talk that Ukraine needs to go to the negotiating table with Russia. Do you feel an erosion of support, or do you feel support is just as strong as ever?
I wouldn't say it's an erosion of support. I think that it's natural, because what happens is people are starting to get scared in the face of the winter, which is approaching. The prices, the gas prices, the inflation, the cold, and so on and so forth. So it's a natural process in a way that people start looking for simple solutions, and the simplest solutions to them looks like everything will end when Putin and Ukraine will sit at the table of the negotiations.
What do you tell them? What do you say to them?
We say to them that we have lived under a ceasefire for 8 years, starting from 2014, and look where it got us. For this man, for Putin, it's not about simply having a small chunk or a small piece of some land. It's about restoring the greatness of the Soviet Union. And those are some my idea. He has been fanatic about this. And what was the greatest moment for Soviet Union in terms of the territory? In my opinion, it was when they controlled half of Berlin. So should be something the European capitals should be thinking about. And moreover, not just that. So what is happening in Ukraine right now is that we are gaining momentum in terms of the offensive. And Putin is throwing more and more people, the fresh conscripts, on the battlefront, without training, without proper equipment, without anything. But if he gets away with it, if he gets away with this war, that would mean that regardless all of the sophisticated military support, training, and modern technology weapons that the West and other countries have been providing to Ukraine, Putin would simply outnumber us in terms of the quantity of the people. And that is precisely the point he's trying to make. In this last 8 months, we have seen that his army is far from being the second greatest in the world, is far from being the most modern and progressive and technologically sophisticated, but it is very numerous. And this is precisely the point he's trying to make in this war, that I don't care how many highly sophisticated tanks you have, as long as I'm having 4 or 5 million people ready to get a rifle and go to the front line, I'm fine. So in his reality, the country that is the strongest is the country who has the most population. So in his vision, it's not about the economy. It's not about industrial output. It's about the quantity of the population. And if he gets away with this war and will try to establish this kind of vision on the world order, in my opinion, we will live in a very dangerous place, because by no chance the European continent can outnumber Russia, China, or India in terms of the quantity of the population. So he's trying to put the economy not just on the second place, but on the third, on the fourth, on the fifth. And on the first place, he's trying to put the brute force and the simple quantity of the people. And I mean, that changes the perspective completely. That is a drastic change. And I think we cannot allow it to happen. And all this ceasefires and everything that is being discussed is an instrument to allow him to get a break, to continue with the offensive later in spring. So I think that we want this war to end for good. We want to defeat Russia. And believe me, Ukraine is the country that is the most interested in ending this war as soon as possible. But we want to do it in terms of a defeat of the aggressor, so that we are all sure that there will be no other war in at least the next century.
Okay, I'm not sure what defeat will look like, but we can talk about that. But I want to get your reaction to the New York Times reporting today. This is by a correspondent named Peter Baker, who I know very well. A disagreement has emerged at the highest levels of the U.S. government over whether to press Ukraine to seek a diplomatic end to the war with Russia, with America's top general urging negotiations, while other advisors to President Biden argue that it's too soon. General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has made the case in internal meetings that the Ukrainians have achieved about as much as they could reasonably expect on the battlefield before winter sets in, and so they should try to cement their gains at the bargaining table, according to officials informed about the discussions. Can I get your reaction to that?
Yeah, my reaction would be very simple. I mean, what we're trying to achieve on the battlefield actually is to push Russia back to its internationally recognized borders.
Not even Ukraine. 2014, but all the way back.
Yeah, of course, because I mean, the borders of Ukraine have not changed, and were never formally challenged. Those are the Russian borders that have changed, and they never provided for Donbass, Crimea, not even Abkhazia or Ossetia in Georgia. So the task in this war, I think, and not just of Ukraine but of the global community, is to push it as far as to the borders that have been internationally recognized, and that is what we're doing. So I'm not really sure what do we have to negotiate about here. So it looks like we are ready to allow, in this logic, any country to expand beyond its internationally recognized border, and then force everyone else to sit at the negotiation table and press them to recognize this expansion. I mean, if that is the case, again, we are turning back to this argument of the brute force that becomes paramount instead of a rules-based society, instead of the economics that is the prime power in the world. Instead of the progress, instead of of modern technologies, and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure that the USA, who have been safeguarding freedom, democracy, all those values that are important to the Western civilization we're living in, are ready to change their opinion and say that, okay, from now on, everyone who makes it to expand the border just because he wants it, and he then is successful in holding this piece of land, can claim its property on that piece of land, regardless of what others think. I don't think this is the case.
I guess it's easy to talk about compromise with somebody else's country.
Absolutely. And moreover, I'm a bit astonished that such talks start right now when Ukraine is very successful on its southern front. I mean, I think by the end of November, in the center of Kherson, we will see the Ukrainian flag, and there is a very clear advancement. And in my opinion, the timing is really suspicious. I mean, I don't quite understand why it is happening now. We have heard today that Putin has even refused to be personally present in the G20 summit. So, I mean, all those signals might show that we are witnessing the start of an eclipse of the Russian political regime that Putin has constructed. And this talks regarding the sitting and negotiating might look to someone as an attempt to save that regime from falling.
You think it's that serious? The fact that Putin didn't appear and his absence was beyond notable. I mean, I've watched Russia for 2 decades. The fact that he didn't appear when his defense minister announced that they were going to withdraw from Kherson, and then the fact that he's not going to the G20, your instincts. And by the way, I know you were born in Moscow, so and you know Russia very well. Your instincts tell you that something is afoot in terms of Putin's ability to hold on to power in the Kremlin, possibly.
I think that would be the only outcome of this war on the Russian side. I don't believe in the mass uprising in Moscow and St. Petersburg by the local population. But what I do believe in is the elite struggle. And as far as we see, the more Putin is failing on the battlefront, the more his tactics fail on the battlefront, the more his surrounding, his circle of power is questioning his rationale and his ability to kind of see through it and to end this war in the least damaging way for themselves, for their own security and property.
What do you think, Dmytro? What do you think is? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Sure. No. And just going back to the argument. I mean, I think you would agree that this man has been absolutely fanatic about his personal greatness. I mean, his whole life, his whole political career was to be able to sit at the most important tables, yielding power and influencing like global decisions. And G20 is one of the most influential tables one could expect. And he is deliberately refusing to have one of the 20 seats that are there. So, in my opinion, this should not be underestimated.
Very interesting. What do you think is going on in Kherson? I mean, why are they withdrawing? Do you think it's legitimate? Sorry, and I'm going to ask you about 5 questions in one, and you can take your pick, but is it legitimate? Is it a trick? And, we're hearing that there could be originally 20,000 Russian soldiers there. Maybe it's down to 10 now because they've been withdrawing over the last couple of weeks. They've just become an incredible target as they try to cross now from one bank of the Dnipro to the other, because they are now within range of Ukrainian artillery, and by the hour they become more within range of that artillery. I mean, it can be a horrible outcome in terms of Russian losses as they try to get out of Kherson and go to the other bank.
Now we are hearing that as of yesterday, Russia has already lost more than 204,000 people in Ukraine, starting from the day of their aggression. So I mean, that is a huge number. That is an incredibly huge number, and just in a couple of last days, there are different speculations, but we don't know the exact numbers yet. But we're talking about a couple of thousands of people died just trying to run away from the Ukrainian advancement. And I
just in a couple of days.
Just in a couple of days, and I'm saying to run away because that is precisely what is happening. So the Ukrainian forces were targeting the means of communications of the Russians since mid summer. And I think in late August, they succeeded to cut off and to severely damage the means of communication of the Russian troops in Kherson. And now what we are witnessing, and what the reports are from the military intelligence and from the people at the front line there in the Kherson region, is that the Russians have no comms at all. I mean, there are certain units that literally do not know what to do, whether they should stand their ground, whether they should keep the position, or they should change the location, or should they take something with them, the equipment, should they leave them. So they are absolutely disoriented, and they have no comms. They have not been provided with any instructions, and it looks like, I mean, this is not an organized retreat, but it looks more, unfortunately, like fleeing in chaos. Even though I must say, the statement of Surovikin and the Shoigu were quite unorthodox, because this never happened before, neither when they were retreating from the north of Ukraine, from Sumy and Chernihiv region, nor when they were retreating from the Kharkiv region. So there was never a statement made by some top military official saying that we are doing this and that. So that is the reason why we are still expecting the developments in Kherson to be not that 100% obvious. Our troops are very careful. I think that in terms of the of a date that we might say that Kherson will be completely liberated, we should aim at the end of November, maybe start of December. So the troops are very careful not to be lured into some kind of a trap. And for that reason, we are very restrictively positive. Let's put it that way.
Two questions to you, because I know I've taken a lot of your time. One would be, what happens after Kherson is taken? Do you think this progresses to what comes into Ukrainian gun sights? Crimea?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as I said in the beginning, the aim is to push Russia back to its internationally recognized borders. And the Crimea was never part of the Russia, and the border was never there. The border was close to the Rostov-na-Donu, and that is precisely where they should fall back.
Do you think that could still happen in the wintertime? How quickly would that happen?
I think that we are talking more about some early spring, because obviously it will take some time to gather forces and to clear up the whole region of Kherson. We're not talking just about one city, which is big, but also about some small villages, and we need to reinforce the flanks, the position. So obviously this will take some time, resources. But then again, I think that the aim is clearly to advance and to push the Russians back home.
Last question to you. You were meeting with Europeans, and you know that they've just come through with a financial package for Ukraine to help the economy. And I mean, the economy has had the rug pulled out from under it, and it was blocked by Viktor Orban in Hungary, and he used a veto. What would you say about Hungary, and how does the EU, how should they deal with Hungary and Orban?
In my opinion, what has happened is that Hungary is just bargaining on the corpse and on the blood of Ukrainians. It's not a very pleasant thing. I personally know some very great and patriotic Hungarians who are really supporting us and who are trying to to bring to senses the political elite of Hungary. But all in all, I think that it might be a rather short-sighted approach, and definitely not the most friendly one. Of course, we would like to see our neighbor, literal neighbor, to be more welcoming in understanding all the tragedies that our nation is going through, and the importance of this war. not just for Ukraine, but for the whole continent, in my opinion. I think that, at first Russia put to test the Ukrainian military in February, in March, maybe even in April. And after the military has passed this test, it's a different army, I tell you. It's a very self-confident, a very venturesome, a very daring army. Now will be a test for the civilians. Us in cold houses, in dark cities, in cars with empty tanks, fuel tanks. This is a test for the civilian population. But once the winter goes, it will be a different nation. And not just the Ukrainians, but I think for all of the Europe, for all the Europeans out there who will be able to overcome this challenge and this test, and refuse to be bullied, refuse to be blackmailed by some psychopath who thinks that he can own the world. So, in my opinion, if Orban does not understand that, what can I say? I'm very saddened by that.
Dmytro Natalukha, member of parliament in Ukraine, so great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dana. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor, really. Thank you.
All right, Sir Mark Lyall Grant is the former National Security Advisor for the United Kingdom. He was also the permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations. Hello, Mr. Ambassador.
Good evening.
Good to see you again. How significant is this withdrawal, first of all, around Kherson announced by the Russians?
I think it is significant simply because Kherson was the first sort of major new city for Russia to take when they invaded the rest of Ukraine in February this year. So they've now lost that territory. Kherson is also the capital of one of the 4 provinces which they annexed just last month, and with great fanfare, Putin announcing that these were now part of the Russian territory. So essentially, he doesn't control 100% of any of these 4 territories that he's annexed, and he doesn't control 2 of the capital cities of those territories, both Zaporizhzhia and now shortly Kherson. So I think it is symbolic in that. It is a defeat for President Putin. It's noticeable that he hasn't appeared on television to announce this withdrawal. It's been left to some of the senior generals. And although the Ukrainians are reacting cautiously, obviously fearful that the Russians have laid some booby traps or are planning some sort of late ambush, nonetheless, I think it is a very significant victory for them, and therefore important for continued Western support for the Ukrainian government.
So you believe that the support should continue? Should it increase? And you, in watching the U.S. midterm elections, are you concerned about how a Republican-controlled House will affect any of that?
Well, so far, the military support for Ukraine, the vast majority of which, let's be honest, has come from the Americans, although the Europeans have chipped in with quite a lot of military equipment in more recent months, is supported by bipartisan way in America. However, there is certainly a fringe, maybe more than a fringe of the Republican Party that believes that enough is enough and America should no longer be offering all this financial and military support to Ukraine. So if the Republicans do gain control of the Senate, then I think it would become more difficult for President Biden to continue that support. If they just take control of the House, but the Senate remains divided or in the hands of the Democrats, then I think the policy will continue as it is at the moment.
How long do you think the United States and Europe will continue to support aid to Ukraine, military aid? Does it go back to 2014? Borders, and I wouldn't call them borders, but ceasefire lines. Or do you think that Europe and the US will continue to support Ukraine if and when they may start attacking and shelling the Crimea itself?
I think they will continue to support. I mean, there is very widespread support within the G7 as a whole and within the European continent for Ukraine. I think this winter is obviously going to be difficult, but once we're through that, I would expect the support for Ukraine to ramp up even further, to be honest. So I don't sense any lessening of that support for Ukraine. Now, what is also happening behind the scenes is that the United States in particular are putting some pressure on President Zelensky to make clear that he is open to talks, dialogue with the Russians about a possible end to the conflict. Zelensky has said, yes, I am prepared to do that, but provided there are a number of conditions. And one of them is that Russia should be prepared to discuss withdrawing from all the territory of Ukraine, including Crimea, not just the new territories they've taken since February this year. Now, that I don't see that being an opportunity for early serious negotiations, because Putin could not accept that. It would just be an even greater failure than had so far in Crimea.
Are you as shocked at these figures that U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, released this week, where he said there's 100,000 soldiers that have been either KIA or missing or wounded on the Russian side? And then he was asked the same about Ukraine, and he said the same number, 100,000. And then in addition, he added 40,000 civilian deaths into this. I mean, that is a stunning number of killed and wounded.
It is a stunning number. I think it's very difficult to be totally confident of figures on either side of this conflict. The Ukrainians are saying that 75,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. Now, normally there would be a ratio of something like 1 to 3, 1 to 4 in terms of deaths to injuries. That would suggest even larger figures on the Russian side. I don't think what the Americans have released is completely out of order. I think there have been very heavy losses on both sides and a very high percentage of deaths on both sides, undoubtedly. And that's aside, of course, the Ukrainian civilians have been killed.
Do you see an emerging ideology in Russia, something that we haven't seen before? When you listen to these speeches by President Putin, most recently, it's not the first time, but most recently going on and on against liberal Western democracy and defeating Satanism. And I mean, how do you read that?
Well, I think for some time, Putin has tried to set himself up as the so-called defender of family values, traditional values, if you like. And he believes that the West is in decline, and that he points to issues around LGBT rights, for instance, as an example of that decline. And so he has deliberately positioned himself at the more conservative end of that spectrum and saying, look, the West is got decadent, it's disappearing, and here is an opportunity for Russia to regain its historical strength. He sees that task of making Russia great again, if you excuse the phrase, in very zero-sum terms, that the only way he can do that when Russia has a stagnant population and a very narrowly based economy, very few allies around the world, by weakening his perceived enemies, whether that be the European Union, NATO, the United States, the United Kingdom, etc. So he uses the hard power tools that he has at his disposal because he doesn't have so many soft power tools as a country like China perhaps has, for example. So I'm not sure it's an ideology. I think it's more a nostalgia and a nationalism harking back to the great days of the Russian or Soviet empires.
I mean, it may be a very clever way to appeal to conservatives in the U.S. as well. He's always trying to divide, so-called liberal democracies or democracies as well. And by playing on the LGBTQ differences in the U.S., I mean, he may feel that helps divide America somehow.
Yes, certainly. And there is a a sort of Trumpist wing of the Republican Party that is rather sympathetic to some of those ideological views. And of course, Trump himself seemed to give Putin a relatively easy ride when he was president of the United States. And I'm sure that President Putin would be delighted if President Trump ran again in a couple of years' time and actually won the presidency back.
As a former national security advisor, I know you're well connected and you talk to your colleagues. And while the answer may seem obvious to you, I'd appreciate you kind of giving us your insight about why is it so important, especially in Europe, when people talk about Russia cannot be seen to be victorious in Ukraine. I mean, what are you really fighting?
I think you are fighting for a preservation of the post-Second World War international order. You know, a lot of the boundaries across the world, particularly in Africa, for instance, are man-made. You know, they're relatively recent. And that is the case in Europe as well. And if one allows those borders to be violated with impunity, then I think the whole underpinning and structure of this post-Second World War consensus falls apart. And that is the threat that Western democracies now face. If Russia and China start leading a rebellion, if you like, against that international order and promoting a separate, different order based on different values, not based on democracy, open trade, human rights, the rule of law, the things on which the current order is based, if they manage to succeed in attracting some developing countries, some more neutral countries into their camp, then I think that poses a very serious long-term strategic threat to the Western way of life. And I think that's what's at stake in this union.
Mr. Ambassador, just the last question to you, if you'll permit me, and that is, as a former permanent representative to the United Nations for the UK, I mean, obviously the UN was one of the safeguards of that post, war period to create, stability around the world, and to stop, the movement of borders and expansion of countries, and to bring kind of a, world stability. And then now you have Russia, which is dedicated to, promoting chaos, whether it be in the Middle East or Africa, or whether now it be, right here in Europe. Why is Russia, do you think, still allowed to sit on the UN Security Council? And should there be a move to remove them?
Well, the simple answer, if you like, Dana, to that question is that in order to remove a permanent member of the Security Council from the Security Council, it requires not only a large majority of UN members, theoretically possible, but also the agreement of all 5 existing permanent members, including Russia. So obviously Russia is not going to permit itself to be voted off the UN Security Council. So that won't happen. Now, is that an undesirable situation? Yes, of course it is. I think it's more the principle that has been violated, I think, in the UN Charter is that the UN Charter makes clear that if there is a conflict issue in which one of the Security Council members are directly involved, they should not vote on that issue. Now, it is that statute in the UN Charter that has been violated. Unfortunately, it is potentially in the interests of all the 5 permanent members to not abide by that, because they feel that there may be particular conflicts in which they're involved where they still want to have the veto. But it is possible to say under the UN Charter, Russia should not be allowed to vote when there is an issue like the Ukraine conflict where they are directly involved.
And how would that help? The
only way of trying to overcome the paralysis that there currently is in the Security Council. It isn't possible to vote Russia off the council.
But how would that help the situation if Russia had to abide by, not being allowed to vote on the UN Security Council? Where would that have taken us?
Well, then potentially you would be able to get enforceable sanctions imposed on Russia, which every country in the world would have to abide by. Now, of course, China might still veto sanctions against Russia. But suppose that they didn't feel able to do that or willing to do that, it would mean that the sanctions that are imposed on Russia at the moment are only imposed essentially by Western countries, the European Union, the United States, the UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, etc., not by China or India or Brazil or South Africa. Now, if there was a Security Council resolution imposing those sanctions, as there is, for instance, on Iran or on North Korea, then every country in the world would be obliged to abide by that sanctions, and it would have much more effect.
Sir Mark Lyall Grant, always a privilege to talk to you, sir. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Dana.
In the coming days, Ukraine will liberate the rest of Kherson Oblast, or the larger region. Fighting will continue across the Dnymtro. The winter will slow Ukraine's advance, but not freeze it. How does this war end? Well, for now, it's clear as mud. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening to Backstory, and I'll talk to you again soon.